Welcome to another edition of Catholic Family News Special Report. I am Brian McCall, Editor-in-Chief, and I'm happy today to be joined by journalist and author Philip Lawler. Welcome to Catholic Family News today.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure.
We're delighted to speak with you about a recently published book that is called Contagious Faith. Contagious Faith, and I just finished this morning reading. I've been reading it for the past couple of days. You can see here from the Sophia Institute Press website the cover of the book. It is essentially about the past year of our lives, about the coronavirus incident, and particularly some reflections on the church and from a Catholic perspective. So for our viewers who may not know Mr. Lawler, which I guess there may be a few of you, he is, as I said, a Catholic author and journalist. He's the founder of Catholic World News, also editor of Crisis Magazine, has written many other books. He did his undergraduate degree at Harvard University, which, having gone to a different school a little bit south in Connecticut, I'm willing to forgive him for that lapse of judgment going to Harvard. But no, and then he also did do graduate work at the University of Chicago before beginning his journalism career. Much more extensive biography, but that's sort of a few of the highlights. So the book is Contagious Faith. And my perspective, it really is a book contrasting two things: contagious faith with contagious fear, is the message that I at least took from reading the book. So if we can maybe start, Mr. Lawler, in talking about that. One of the premises of the book seems to be that the world and our country and Catholics sort of subjected themselves to a very strange and unusual year, lost access to many things, most importantly the Mass and sacraments, out of fear, a fear of death particularly. How do you think that that has come about? Why do you think that our world today, and even Catholics, live in what I think you paint as an unreasonable fear of death?
Yeah, well, it's an unreasonable fear in one way. It's quite reasonable in another. I mean, we will die.
Yes.
and that is something that could be fearful depending on your disposition, the disposition of your soul. And if you're worried about death because you're worried about your eternal soul, then that's a good thing. But if you live your entire life worried about death, then you end up not really living your life. And for a Christian in particular, death should be something that isn't so fearsome. It's a step that we take to eternity. It's something none of us looks forward to. And yet, in one sense, you do. You think of St. Paul, you know, and I haven't reached that stage, I can assure you, but it's not the worst thing that can happen. The worst thing that can happen is sin and damnation. And we have for too long spent too much time worrying about our own comfort. And that, I think, actually is more what's going on here, because, you know, fairly early on, we all realized that we were most of us were unlikely to die of COVID. It was a fear of disease. And, you know, that's another thing. You will get sick.
Yes.
It's something that happens to all of us. And you take reasonable precautions, but you don't arrange your whole life around a desire not ever to be sick, because it's foolish. It's hypochondria, you know, and we're now suffering from a sort of mass hypochondria.
Is this like a societal, what was it? Hughes, what was this for her? The millionaire that was the classic hypochondria. Right. Yes. It's almost like the society's become that. Well, right. It's interesting. And what much of the book then about is contrasting that fear, that fear, you're right, in a certain sense, it's a reasonable fear, but if disproportionate or directed the wrong way, to the church's reaction to that fear. And you document throughout the book that the church in many cases just closed the door, shut things down. And in many cases, as you point out, when not required to do. So I'll mention, I spent most of the past year in the state of Florida. And when the governor did issue some regulations, the very first essential business or essential activity that he listed was religion, and made clear that none of the restrictions applied to any not just Catholic churches, but any place of worship. But yet many churches just shut their doors for months and are still shut. So you do, I think, make a very strong case that sometimes this was the state requiring it, but many times not. Many people I've heard react and say, oh, the church has always done this. Whenever there's been plagues and things, the church always just shuts things down. Obviously, I don't think you take that view, but how would you maybe answer that? How would you say that the church's reaction in general, and the hierarchy in particular this time in 2020, differs from the way the church has dealt with other health problems, health emergencies?
Well, I'm not a historian, so I don't know the
Okay.
whole story, but people often cite the example of St. Charles Borromeo closing the churches
Yes.
in his
Yes.
archdiocese, which he did.
Hmm.
And then he had mass out in the streets.
Yes.
And he said that if you are looking for a priest and you can't find one, look for me because I'll be there if I'm the last one standing.
Yes.
He was committed to administering the sacraments no matter what. Now, of course, you take reasonable precautions. We
Mhm.
all do, and we all have. I mean, it's not just this year that
Mhm.
reasonable pastors would tell you, don't come to church on Sunday if you're sick.
Yes.
That's just prudence. And it has always been so. And if you are legitimately in danger, then that's also a legitimate reason. But if there's no danger, no pressing danger, uh, a reasonable pastor would be asking you, where are your priorities? And a reasonable pastor, thank God I have one, would be doing everything he could to keep the sacraments coming, however that happens,
Mm.
however it's done. And it it boggles my mind, and it really saddens me to read about Ireland, where my ancestors come from, where the mass is illegal now. And the government has vouchsafed to agree that it will be legal again in another week. This is in Ireland.
Yes.
And I know that there are priests doing what they did during the times of persecution, which is celebrating the mass illegally at the mass rocks, as they're called.
Yes.
But how could this be? And how could it be, by the way, that the bishops of Ireland claim they didn't know that
Mm.
the government had illegalized, had banned the mass? Uh, the Irish
Yes.
Catholic newspaper had the story on April 29th. The primate of all Ireland was saying on May 6th, I'm sorry, March 29th. The primate of all Ireland was saying on April 16th that he wasn't aware of it. How can that be? Because I knew about it. And it's not my job to administer the sacraments
Right.
in Ireland. It
Yes.
is the duty of the bishops to do it. How could it be that it wasn't their top priority? There's nothing more important.
Mm. And you cite the example of St. Charles Borromeo, whom I believe, in addition to closing his basilica or the cathedral, but did have mass outside, he also personally went and administered last rites among those suffering from the plague. And again, not to say there aren't people who are certainly sick and have died from COVID, but if you compare COVID as a disease to the bubonic plague, and particularly to the very limited medical care they had at the same time of St. Charles Borromeo, the risk to him to bring the sacraments was certainly, we can say, astronomically, I would say, greater
That's
than any
right,
risk
right,
today. Yes.
right. And I don't want to diminish. It takes a degree of heroism for
Yes.
a priest to go into a ward where there are people who have a highly communicable disease.
Yes.
On the other hand, you know, again, I don't want to take it lightly, but that is what they signed up for.
Yes.
We
Yes.
expect soldiers to go into dangerous situations. There are situations,
Yes.
circumstances where we expect priests to go into dangerous
Yes.
situations, and that's one of the reasons we honor the priesthood.
Yes. Well, on a natural level, it's like doctors and nurses, right? They don't say when you come to the hospital with a communicable disease, well, I need to be safe. I'm not going to treat you. they
Right.
they they are first responders who take on that risk and that responsibility to help people naturally, whereas priests on the supernatural level you would think should take the same.
Yes,
Uh,
absolutely.
and I have to say, I'm very happy because in your book, in addition to stating some hard facts about some shepherds who maybe use a phrase of Benedict XVI, seemed maybe to run for fear of the wolves. There are stories of some of priests, individual priests who did stand up. I'll just mention again, here in Florida, I know of a couple priests together who in the last 2.5 weeks of Lent in 2020, administered over 700 extreme unctions. I don't remember the exact number, but it was in the range of 700. And almost all of them, a large number of them, were not to people that they normally went to their church. They just, there were people and family members dialing for priests, calling any number they could find if they could find a priest. And it was interesting, mostly not for COVID deaths. So there were maybe, I think, a few, but just ordinary life issue, where a grandparent or someone was dying and couldn't find the sacrament. So there certainly were, and you mentioned other stories like that of priests who were really heroic, above and beyond, not even just for their own flock, but any Catholic who called out.
Right.
But you mentioned that put a lot of them in a difficult position because they often faced superiors who were not supporting them in that heroism. So could you maybe say a little bit about that? How is it that a priest, could say to their bishop, well, I know you said I can't bring the sacraments, but I just have to do it. Maybe could you speak about that issue a little bit, that difficulty for priests?
That's a real difficulty, and because a priest has sworn obedience to his bishop, and that's not something that they can or should take lightly. And if what the bishop is telling them is within the realm of prudential judgment, I think they are bound by their duty to obedience. There comes a point where you say, the bishop's orders here are clashing with my fundamental vocation. And I'm not going to tell any priest what to do in that circumstance, but I am going to acknowledge that it's a real crisis of conscience. I do know some priests who ask their bishops, are you telling me this under obedience? Because if you're telling me this sort of as a public policy expert, well, I don't care.
Right, exactly.
You're not a public policy expert. Or if you're telling me this as a administrative question, to keep us out of trouble, well, I'm willing to be in trouble with the law. So are you saying this under obedience? And thereby put, at that point, the moral onus is on the bishop, because if it's under obedience, then the priest feels his conscience is clear.
And in those cases, did sometimes the answer come back, no, it's not, I'm not ordering you in obedience, or did they just not get an answer sometimes?
In every case with which I'm familiar, they did not get a straight answer. There is one case in which a friend of mine pursued the issue and had a long talk with his bishop, and that's all I know.
Interesting. Now, another issue you draw and talk about in the book, have a whole chapter on sacraments and the importance of sacraments. This brought up is a real difference, a real important point of Catholic theology, that we go to church, go to a building, not just to sort of be inspired. I mean, we can go, that does happen, but not just to go to be inspired or subjectively to feel better, but that being there physically, particularly when it comes to the Mass and receiving the sacraments, is essential. We don't say that the apostles, other than St. John, were at the foot of the cross because they virtually were there, from the other side of Jerusalem, right? We say St. John was the only one there because he was the only one physically there. I think you talk a lot about that, and that's something we think non-Catholics might not understand, or even maybe some Catholics. So do you think in a certain sense is that God can always bring good out of bad things? Is there a way that this experience could help Catholics to better appreciate and understand that importance of physical location, of being present physically for the Mass and sacraments?
I certainly hope so. It's not the same to watch it on the Mass on TV or live stream. It's not the active participation. You're remote. It's a virtual Mass. And it's not just that you can't receive communion, it's that you're not there. And I certainly hope that there's a hunger that's built up for the Mass, for the sacraments. I don't know how well that will overcome the message that we've been getting much too much from our pastors in the last year, that, oh, don't worry about it, you can watch the live stream. And it's not the same. You know, we're asking for fish and you're giving us a stone.
Yes.
It's and that message, I think it's going to be very difficult to walk back that message. It's very difficult to tell people for a year, don't worry about it if you can't get to Mass, and then say, oh, by the way, now you have to come to Mass, particularly because there are people who are still, for good or bad reasons, frightened.
Yes.
As frightened as they were 6 months ago. And so how do you tell them now you have to come back? But I will say this, I know that it certainly increased my love for the Mass, for being there. You know, when we went through a period where we were going to Mass in a parking lot, which is kind of awful, objectively.
Yeah, we did a few of those, and it's definitely very strange.
But it's better than nothing.
Yes.
And then, you know, not in a beautiful church, but in a kind of cramped situation. Well, it should have been a cramped situation, but of course we're all 10 feet from each other and so forth. And, you know, it's a lot of people have been forced, I think, a lot of people have been forced to think through what the Mass means to them and what they want from the Mass, and also to recognize it's not all about what they want. It's about what God wants and about how God should be worshipped. You know?
Yes, that's a really good point, right? Because you talk a bit in the book about when some churches have opened, there's been some, I forget what word you use, not grotesque, but ugliness maybe, that's been added into
Mhm.
the Mass and into church, in the name of, again, health, and you know, some people's attitude has been, well, I'm happy to put up with that, you know, for me, for what I get. But that's interesting how you say that. We've maybe lost sense that the Mass is not for us completely, not even primarily, but is for God. And are these things fitting for Him? I think you talk a little bit in the book, particularly about a priest wearing a mask while fulfilling his duties as a priest saying Mass. Could you maybe share your thoughts on that? Why that is particularly problematic?
Oh, well, you know, it's interesting. You read through the Psalms and you see how often there's hide not your face from us, O Lord. Uh,
Mm,
to show your face, to see the face of God, to see the face of our
yes.
Lord. The Saint John Paul II used to use that phrase quite a bit, to see the face of Jesus. And the priest acting in persona Christi, to see his face. And that's on one side. On
Hmm.
the negative side, a mask it's a barrier. You
Mm,
know, it is inherently frightening.
mm.
Uh, as a child, you know, I remember the bad guys always wore masks. And
Yes.
I guess that's been reversed, hasn't it? Now it's the good guys, they're wearing masks, supposedly. But uh, it's a barrier.
Yes.
It's a lack of openness. And of course, it's also cutting down so much on our communications, because there's so much you communicate with your face, not necessarily by making noises. And that's hidden too. And it's
Yes.
not just
Yes.
the priests, it's all of us. And it's a message that we send to each other, that I look at you as a threat and I need to protect myself against you.
Actually, I thought that was a very profound line that I remember reading in the book, where you said we look at everyone with suspicion. And you have another part, I think, where you talk about lepers, or in a sense, we're treating everybody, these aren't your words, but what I took from it, we're treating like everybody, we look at everybody as like a leper.
Mhm.
And so it's more than just the priests. So what kind of broader social consequences could this have for us, you know, if this ever does come to an end?
If it does,
Yes.
you know, here's the other thing that frightened me. We've been talking about what the church has done, and it's in the context of what society has done.
Hmm.
And what society has done is the most radical public policy ever,
Mm,
aside from, you know, from major warfare.
mm,
Governments have deliberately tanked their own economies.
Yes.
They have tossed civil liberties to the wind, and they have inflicted a lot of harm on a lot of people. And yes, I don't mean to minimize. I know a lot of people have died of COVID, or
Hmm.
a lot of them have had their deaths hastened by it.
Hmm.
Uh, but and also, there's also a lot of people who have died of diseases that were not treated because they could not get adequate treatment because our society was closed down, or of conditions, alcoholism, depression, suicides are up,
Yes.
domestic abuse is up. It's the damage to families is horrendous. And the notion that the only people who are compassionate are the ones who want to shut down society is just very wrong-headed, because think of all the damage that's being done. I'm sure you have friends, as I do,
Oh,
and
yes.
relatives who have suffered severely because of this, not because of the disease, but because of the reaction.
Yes, very, very much so. Who people have been harmed more, who never even got sick, but have been harmed, lost their job, didn't spend the last days with their parents, for example, when they were dying. So you definitely are aware of those. So I absolutely do think you're right. I think some of the facts you've just touched on, that will church attendance ever go back, right? Once you're told, I know people have not set foot in a Catholic church and been to mass in over a year. Like you, I said to my wife the other day, that boggles my mind. I couldn't imagine not being able to receive communion, not being at mass at Calvary for that long. It reminded me so much. I think it was Padre Pio who said the world could live more without the sun than without the mass. But if you're away from it that long and get used to it, will you go back? The social effects, will they end? So I know, to ask about that, I know you had some public correspondence last year with Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano that I think was published. You asked him some questions. Um, he has written a bit about this crisis and sees in it definitely something more nefarious. I mean, in terms of, there are obviously people maybe are just out of fear doing things, but that there are perhaps some in the civil governments in the world, maybe even in the church, who want to use this as an opportunity to advance some ways to divide us, ways to bring it forward. What do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think it is all maybe just overreact in fear, or do you think there is perhaps some malice in some people behind some of the things we've had to live through?
I don't know if I'd call it outright malice, but I do see dangerous tendencies. There's no
Okay.
question that there's a huge increase in the authority of government,
Yes.
and unelected government, particularly in
Particularly.
our country.
Yes.
And, public officials who are, the tail is wagging the dog in so many jurisdictions. The governor issues an emergency regulation, and that emergency regulation is still in effect 14 months later. Well, what's the emergency and what's the limitation? Why
Mm,
hasn't the legislature even taken this up? And the answer to that question, I think, is the legislature doesn't want to take it up because it's a hot potato.
mm.
And the governor certainly doesn't want to retract it because he enjoys the power that he's been given.
Yes.
And most people, when given power, enjoy it. I don't think it's the conspiracy theory. Uh, I don't think it's conspiracy theory thinking when you point out what people are saying quite openly.
Yes.
And
It's not a conspiracy if they tell you. Yes.
exactly, if
Yes.
it's quite open, when
Yes.
Dr. Fauci tells us that we might be able to go back to normal maybe next Christmas, or I don't know what he's saying now, it's always sometime in the future and not the
Mm,
very near future. I take him seriously. That's what he thinks.
mm.
And if he has his way about it, that's what it will be. But why does he have his way about it? Why don't we reassert our own civil rights? And similarly within the church, I do think that there are people who are content to let things slide, to advance the secular agenda rather than the religious agenda.
Hmm.
And we're seeing a fairly deep divide there too. And I, um, I think it's fascinating how the lines, uh, how the divisions line up consistently.
Hmm.
You can almost predict which side of the controversy someone is going to be on by where he goes to church, which parish, you know.
Interesting. Although there's been some other little interesting surprises to me, at least. You mentioned a few cases, and I think you mentioned in the book mostly Protestant churches that did exercise their rights under the Constitution to try to push back. But I'm aware of a case, for example, the St. Thomas More Legal Society took on in upstate New York and in New Jersey, which was a Catholic priest and actually Orthodox rabbi who came together to bring the lawsuit together. So it's been interesting to see. I think you're right. A lot of it easily falls where you'd expect, but there's been some interesting surprises, I think, of people working together against this. So to follow up on what we were talking about a little bit before, you've mentioned, I think it was a really good point about government. Instead of the elected officials, the people with the responsibility, actually taking responsibility, pushing it off, and having unelected officials, having experts. You mentioned Dr. Fauci, who's never been elected to anything, kind of making the decisions, and then the actual elected officials sort of wringing their hands. Well, what can we do? These are the experts. Do you think to some extent that has become a phenomenon in the church where, bishops may be prudent? Okay, let me listen to the advice of experts, but have become very contented maybe over the past several decades to sort of let themselves be ruled by experts, to be sort of told what the experts think and then just adopt it, as opposed to being the monarch of their diocese, right? Being the who is responsible for making the decisions, not just implementing the orders of experts. Do you think that is maybe a tendency that's been a problem in the church?
Yes, I think that's very definitely a tendency, and it's a tendency that doesn't actually, that tendency I don't think splits very well along ideological or theological lines, because there are some fairly conservative bishops, if you want to use that term,
Yes,
who do seem to rely a lot on experts and on programs, and on advanced degrees in Catholic studies of some sort or another. And that's, I don't think, entirely healthy, because what I want in a bishop is a father. You don't take advanced studies in being a father, and of course you listen to advice, of course.
Yes.
But at the end, it's your call,
Yes.
because you know your children, and that's what I want a bishop to be.
Yes, I very much so. A father, not a administrator who follows what Dr. Fauci happens to tell him. Well, thank you. This has been a really interesting conversation. Is there any other parts we haven't touched on of the book you'd like to highlight for us?
Well, I just like to leave people with the idea that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Now, whether Dr. Fauci will agree with me, that would be a first, I think. But I think that what will come of this is probably a smaller but a more committed Catholic Church. I think you will see lower mass attendance whenever the parishes are opened up, but you will see more people. Well, one of the ways that I judge the health of community is you see more people at daily mass, you see more people at Eucharistic adoration, you see more large families, and it will probably be more of the winnowing. People are looking for the parishes, the priests, even the diocese, where the faith is presented to them in all of its fullness. And when that happens, and I am convinced that it will happen, you will see the creative minority that Pope Benedict talked about, and you will see a faith that is active and evangelical, and, as I say, contagious.
Yes, Pope Benedict did talk in those terms of a smaller church, but one that is more committed. And again, there are, and I do appreciate your stories of hope. As I said, we just, for my own family, we didn't miss a single Sunday mass. We were able to attend even weekday masses throughout this whole year. We're able to get to confession with what is our typical, schedule without it being delayed. And again, some of those were we had a few weeks in cars when people weren't sure what could be done. Some confessions outside, not in a typical venue, but there certainly were priests, and you do mention them, who we're our St. Charles Borromeos of our time, and those are the priests that will lead that
That's right.
that movement. So thank you for writing the book. I will again remind it's available from Sophia Institute Press, directly from their website. Contagious Faith, which I was very much attracted by the title. I think it's a wonderful wordplay. From Sophia Press. You can order it. And it is, I will say, a very easy book to read. It's filled with a lot of information and facts, but it's told in a very readable way and a very personal way. I appreciate Mr. Lawler really brings his own experience, as we've been talking about in this interview, not just facts and statistics, though there's, obviously there's facts to back up what he's saying, but it is told from a very personal perspective from the past year. And so it makes it really a very easy book to read. And particularly depending what your circumstance has been in your part of the country, can help you. I mentioned Archbishop Vigano, one of his he has sort of a 3-step plan he always talks about for getting through this difficulty. And the number one is to be aware, right? We need to just understand what's going on, because we can't do anything about it if we don't understand. And so this book will certainly help you, I think, be aware of what happened in the past year, what happened, what bad happened, and also what good, what inspiring stories there are. So I definitely would recommend it to our listeners and our viewers. So thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts with us, and thank you for writing the book.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed our conversation.
Great. Please, if you've enjoyed watching this, please forward it and share it to your contacts, like it, please subscribe to our channel. And that way you'll be notified when more of these special reports and our weekly news program is available. So thank you all for listening, and God bless you.